Hello, and welcome to Children of the Night, an audio essay series where I discuss and analyze the first century of vampire fiction. First off is Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood by James Malcolm Rymer. The story's main vampire is named Sir Francis Varney, although he also goes by Mortimer, Slayton, Baron Stolmeyer of Salzburg, Colonel Deverell, the Monk, Mr. Black, and John Smith over the course of the book. Varney the Vampire. What is there to say about Varney the Vampire? Well, I hated this book. Absolutely hated it. It's over 900 pages of some of the most awkward, overwritten prose I've ever come across. Here's an excerpt from Chapter 2. The tall form turned upon him, and when he got a full view of the face, which he did at that moment, from the opportune circumstance of the lady returning at the instant with a light she had been of her own chamber to procure, even he, Marchdale, with all his courage, and that was great, and all his nervous energy, recoiled a step or two, and uttered the exclamation of, "Great God!" 220 chapters of that. 667,000 words. There's a great deal of filler, pointless comic relief, and other asides. Several times when characters are waiting for an important appointment, they pick up a book and read a chapter. We are then treated to that chapter, even though it has nothing to do in plot or themes with the main story itself. Varney was published anonymously. It has usually been attributed to Thomas Prescott Prest, but later findings indicated it was more likely written by James Malcolm Rymer. Varney is what was called a penny dreadful, which were stories featuring lurid, sensationalized subject matter that were published serially, each part costing a penny. Varney was serialized from 1845 to 1847 and was extremely popular in its day. Its popularity accounted for its length. It was the 19th century's equivalent of a long-running TV show, with continuity errors and major tonal shifts building over time. Whatever its faults may be, and there are many, Varney had stamped a clear influence on vampires to come. The story initially follows the Bannerworth family as the viewpoint characters. It allegedly takes place in the 18th century, but is rather inconsistent in the details. Flora Bannerworth is attacked in her room at night by a dreadful vampiric figure. Her brothers Henry and George and a friend of the family, Mr. Marchdale, chase the fiend away and seemingly kill it, only to find that the light of the full moon revives it, and it escapes. The main cast increases with Flora's fiancé, Charles Holland, family doctor, Dr. Chillingworth, Charles's uncle, Admiral Bell, and the comic relief sailor, Jack Pringle. The cast also decreases, it should be said, as the writer forgets about George's existence after Chapter 34. Sir Francis Varney later returns to the house and introduces himself more formally. He's a very interesting character. It's a shame he didn't star in a better book. Varney is thin, over 6 feet tall and freakishly ugly, with pale white skin and lips, pinkish circles around his eyes, long nails, glassy gray eyes, an elongated face, and a mouthful of dog-like fangs. Varney is often cited as the first vampire depicted with fangs, as they were rarely a feature in folklore. 1828's The Skeleton Count, or The Vampire Mistress, describes the vampires having sharp teeth, but the authenticity of the story is under question. Varney the Vampire is certainly the first widely read story with a fanged vampire. Before, during, and after an attack, Varney is described as having lips that are drawn back, receding much from the large canine-looking teeth. Varney's vampirism follows the rules of early vampire fiction, rules established by Lord Riven in John Polidori's 1819 story, The Vampire, a Tale. He has superhuman strength, yet can be killed by ordinary means. However, he is healed and revived by the light of the full moon. It's stated in the book that vampires usually attack their victims by the light of the full moon or in the nights leading up to it. It's explained that this is so a vampire can heal itself if it encounters resistance and is injured in the attack, which Varney frequently is. However, it's later made clear that vampires simply can't help going out after blood at these times. The full moon drives them into a blood-craving frenzy. His victims and would-be victims are exclusively young women. In addition to his other powers, it seems that he can hold a person still with his gaze, but the effect wears off the moment he breaks eye contact. It's implied that the full moon increases his power. This is never stated outright, but he displays certain abilities when the moon is full, or almost full, that he never shows otherwise. For instance, he never uses his hypnotic power when he's not driven by the moon to drink blood. The phases of the moon affecting a vampire's strength and power is also seen in John Ludwig Tieck's short story Wake Not the Dead, written in German circa 1800, though not published in English until 1823, in which the vampire Brunhilde is most vulnerable on the night of the new moon. Eslin von Klatka, the vampire from the short story The Mysterious Stranger by an anonymous German author, published in English in 1860, also waxes and wanes in power dependent on the phases of the moon. This aspect of vampire lore has all been but dropped in modern fiction, possibly because it's become so associated with werewolves instead. Over the course of the book, vampires are seen embracing the moonlight as if it were manna from heaven. Varney is also able to go out in daylight, with no adverse effects whatsoever. This might be confusing for modern readers, but vampires being killed by sunlight was actually popularized by the 1922 German horror film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, and rarely, if ever, appeared in folklore or fiction prior to that. A few vampires in 19th century fiction dislike the sun. Brunhilde from Wake Not the Dead finds it unpleasant. Dracula loses many of his powers during the hours of the day, once again hours of the day, not exposure to sunlight itself, and a few others seem entirely nocturnal and remain inanimate when it's not night out, but no Victorian vampires burst into flames upon contact with the sun. Interestingly, although pale under normal circumstances, Varney's face appears flushed with red after consuming blood. Vampires in folklore are frequently described as being bloated and having ruddy skin. These are apparently natural changes that corpses go through, but they were mistaken for supernatural effects by superstitious people. Unlike most ugly vampires in fiction, Varney is treated sympathetically. He hates his condition, but he loses control of himself during the full moon. He's suave, charming, and usually cool under pressure. When the Bannerworths accuse him of being a vampire, he laughs it off and proclaims that he would like to go to the next masquerade dressed as a vampire. He's a great swordsman, speaks many languages, and is always polite to the utmost degree, is always ready to give a low, courtly bow. Perhaps the thing that makes Varney sympathetic is his complete incompetence when it comes to being a vampire. He rarely kills anyone. He rarely even manages to drink a young girl's blood without having big, strong men chasing him away before he finishes. One of our first glimpses of him has him repeatedly trying and failing to jump to a roof. He's like Wile E. Coyote. He just tries so hard that it's hard not to root for him. As I said, the first two-thirds of the book follow the Bannerworth family and their dealings with Varney. Varney seems to have been scheming with Marchdale to take ownership of the Bannerworth house and the secret store of riches within it. The text spends a lot of time wavering over whether or not Varney is a real vampire or not, or merely an ugly man playing a long con on the family. It later gives an origin for his appearance, saying he was a hanged man and was revived by Dr. Chillingworth's attempt at galvanization, resulting in his distorted appearance. This is contradicted later when he is explicitly shown to be supernatural. It's very confusing on this point because there are times in the Bannerworth section of the book where Varney genuinely doesn't seem to know why he is the way he is. Later he gives clear accounts of his past and origin. Once again, this was not a story that was planned out ahead of time. Rymer was writing this hastily, was clearly making it up as he went along. In addition, he was most likely writing several other penny dreadfuls at the time. It's honestly not really fair to expect consistency in a book like this. A big deal is made early on of a portrait hanging in the Bannerworth estate. The portrait depicts a man named Sir Renegade Bannerworth, later referred to as Marmaduke Bannerworth, an ancestor of the family who looks exactly like Varney. The main characters visit the grave of this ancestor, find it empty. In any other book, this would all be a setup to reveal that Varney is in fact this person, but in this one, it goes nowhere and is soon forgot about. The plot point is made especially confusing when it's revealed that Flora's father, who left the family in ruin and committed suicide, was also named Marmaduke. What's more, Varney was acquainted with Flora's father. That's just another example of this book not making any sense. The characters other than Varney are dull for the most part. Flora Bannerworth and her fiancé Charles Holland constantly exchange absolutely atrocious romantic dialogue, and Marchdale is a weasel, but none of the other characters are really there. The exceptions are Admiral Bell and Jack Pringle, who are both played to various levels of comic relief. In their introduction, Bell receives a letter saying that his nephew's fiancée is being preyed on by a vampire. Bell, unaware of what a vampire is, thinks that it's some kind of fish of the mermaid order and keeps declaring his disapproval of his nephew marrying a mermaid. As he becomes a main character, he becomes less outrageously stupid and turns into a staunch supporter of Flora and Charles' cloying love. Jack Pringle, however, remains a stereotypical drunk throughout. As you can probably tell, I found these two annoying, but other people seem to find their interaction to be one of the few bright spots in the book. To each their own. By far the best chapter in the Bannerworth section of the book is a scene where Varney is attacked by a mob of people who have discovered that he's a vampire. Clunky writing aside, this chapter is suspenseful and action-packed. Varney fights off crowds of people with a staff, resulting in this bit of action movie dialogue. "Down with the vampire!" shouted the first, who rushed up heedless of the staff. "Down with the fool!" thundered Varney, as he struck the fellow with a terrific blow which covered his face in blood, and he fell back into the arms of his companions. Of course, this rare moment of pippiness is undermined with the "down with the vampire, down with the fool" exchange repeated immediately afterwards. Rymer just couldn't resist the urge to up the word count, I suppose. After this, Varney takes to the rooftops, fleeing from the mob by jumping from roof to roof until finding refuge in an unlikely place, the Bannerworths. Eventually, Varney makes peace with the Bannerworths. I'm skipping a lot of plot in between, of course, but we get a happy ending for Flora and Charles. Normally this is where the book would end, but Varney the Vampire goes on to the last of 3 volumes, and in doing so gets retooled somewhat. In the last third, the focus shifts to the further adventures of Varney himself. Most of the 3rd volume involves Varney getting involved in the lives of a rotating cast of characters. Varney is often antagonistic to them, but everything usually works out for the best for everyone but Varney himself. As the narration says towards the end of the book, it was not the least singular fact in the character of the mysterious being to notice how he always endeavored to make some sort of amends or reparation to those he had so much terrified by his visitations. The first section of the last third is annoying in its repetitiveness. Usually we are introduced to a new family with a young beautiful woman and a mother or aunt who wants her to marry rich. The girl is attacked by a vampire, obviously Varney. They then come into contact with a rich, ugly man. This is also very obviously Varney, often under an assumed name. When this happens, the text is annoyingly unwilling to state the obvious. She is wary of him, possibly because she subconsciously connects him to her attacker. They eventually wind up at the altar, only for Varney to be thwarted at the last minute by somebody showing up with proof that Varney is up to no good. Varney escapes and things are wrapped up with a happy ending for the family, with the girl marrying her real love or whatever. To make things even more repetitive, the accuser is twice accompanied by Admiral Bell, who points out to everyone that Varney is in fact a vampire. It's not clear why he becomes so obsessed with marriage at this time. I read one synopsis that claimed Varney was under the impression that marriage would end his curse, but that's not remotely clear from the text. There's also the possibility that Varney merely wanted someone to feed off every month without having to break into a different young woman's bedroom each time. His feedings aren't usually lethal, so having a wife he could bite every now and then for nourishment would be convenient. Once again, this is only a theory, and it's never made clear in the text. Even with these possible motivations, it's still no excuse to write the same story with a few variations over and over again. I have no idea what possessed Rymer to do that. Even for a book that's mostly filler, I find that to be shockingly lazy writing. As an aside, this marriage plot actually first appeared in the Bannerworth section of the book. Varney leaves the Bannerworths for a time, and the book begins going back and forth between the Bannerworths and a new set of characters. It's the typical mother and daughter setup, with the rich man in this case being Baron Stolmeyer of Salzburg. The revelation that the Baron was actually Varney came as unexpected to me at least, but that's the sort of thing that can only work once, not repeated again and again every few chapters. Back to the 3rd volume. After a time, Admiral Bell stops showing up. The marriage plots continue, but there seems to be some degree of variety. The Bannerworths and the previous reoccurring characters are rarely brought up after this point. Varney says that they're all dead and says of Dr. Chillingworth he has been dead many years. Presumably this last section takes place many years after the first two. Varney is shown to be running out of funds on a regular basis due to his desire to always ostentatiously present himself as wealthy and cultured, and on many occasions he resorts to theft. One of the marriage plots takes place in Naples, where Varney saves the life of Count Polidori, no doubt named after John Polidori, the writer of the first piece of English vampire fiction, and becomes engaged to the man's daughter. The usual wedding day reveal happens, of course. We are treated to one chapter where Varney meets up with a group of 4 other vampires. Here we finally get a bit of the book's vampire lore. It seems vampires are cursed due to a terrible act they committed in life. The vampires, calling themselves a fraternity, are somehow bound to visit the graves of new vampires as they rise for the first time. During the ceremony, they each use a double-edged, broad, flat-bladed weapon, not unlike the swords worn by the Romans, to dig up the dirt and open the coffin. When asked for his name, Varney says he was called Slayton during the reign of Edward III, and that most would know him as Varney. This causes quite a stir, implying that he is infamous among other vampires. Varney's claim that he was around during the reign of Edward III contradicts the origin Varney gives at the end of the book, where he claims that he became a vampire 300 years after that. The underground vampire society is interesting and fairly unique among stories from this period. In most Victorian vampire tales, the reader only encounters one vampire in the entire story. In cases where there are multiple vampires, like Dracula, most of the vampires are shown to be servants of some sort of the head vampire. This story is vampires that operate independently for the most part, but have formed a fraternity that links them together, complete with rules that they must follow. This is actually the standard in most modern vampire stories, with vampire society that mirrors human society. There might be some positions of power, but for the most part, vampires interact with each other as equals. Modern stories that have vampire culture working this way include Vampire the Masquerade, Twilight, Interview with the Vampire, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Being Human. This aspect isn't entirely missing from the Victorian era, however. The 1841 Russian story, The Vampire, by Alexei Tolstoy, features vampires who make a sucking sound when they meet each other in order to recognize their own kind. The aforementioned Mysterious Stranger, where Ezelin von Klatka is gripped by the human character Voislav, and von Klatka, mistaking his strength of the man's artificial arm for that of a vampire, says, "Let me go from the grip of your fist. I see you are my brother, therefore do not hinder me from seeking my bloody nourishment. I am hungry." And Paul Vauval's 1874 novel La Ville Vampire features an entire city of vampires hidden in Yugoslavia. But for the most part, the idea of vampires interacting as equals is rarely seen in this period. In the later chapters, Varney grows weary of his cursed life and makes several unsuccessful attempts at suicide. At one point, he gets on a boat headed for Scotland. He has the intention of jumping into the waters once it gets far enough from the shore. The narration takes some time out to insult Scotland for no particular reason. Quote, "The cabin now began to fill with the passengers, and extraordinarily, as the fact may appear, there were many Scotchmen actually going back again. They were, however, only going to pay visits, for it is one of the popular delusions that Scotchmen try to keep up in this country, that they have left something dear and delightful behind them in Scotland, and that, take it all together, it is one of the most desirable spots in the whole world. It becomes therefore quite necessary for them to go back now and then in order to keep up that delusion. Personal vanity, too, is one of the great characteristics of the nation, and many a Scotchman goes back to Edinburgh, for example, to make an appearance among his old friends and family connections, totally incompatible with his real position in London. After he jumps, he is saved from drowning by 2 brothers named Edwin and Charles Crofton. Upset at his continued existence, he takes revenge on them by turning their sister, Clara, into a vampire himself. After Clara is killed by a stake through her heart, Varney realizes the harm he's caused. "And has it come to this?" he said. "Is this my work? Oh, horror, horror unspeakable! In this some hideous dream or a reality of tragedy so far transcending all I looked for? And if I had tears I should shed them now, but I have none. 100 years ago that fount was dry. I thought I had steeled my heart against all gentle impulses, that I had crushed, completely crushed, Dove, I'd pity in my heart, but it is not so, and still sufficient of my once human feeling clings to me to make me grieve for thee, Clara Crofton, thou victim. He soon after meets up with a priest, to whom he gives an account of his true origin. It seems in life he was called Mortimer, and he lived during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. He got considerable sums of money for keeping loyalists safe, and eventually securing their passage out of England into Holland. Cromwell had found out about Mortimer's practices, and forced him to betray the Duke of Cleveland's prescribed secretary. Upon returning to his home after finding this out, Mortimer, in a fit of rage, hit his 12-year-old son once, accidentally killing him. After that was a confusion of flashing lights. He later discovered that he had been shot by Cromwell's men. He woke up in a hospital, only to pass out again. Finally, he awoke by an open grave with a low voice saying, "Mortimer, in life you did one deed that at once cast you out from all hope that anything in that life would be remembered in the world to come to your advantage. You poisoned the pure font of mercy, and upon such as you can the downy freshness of heaven's bounty fall. Murderer, murderer, of that being sacredly presented to your care by the great Creator of all things, live henceforth a being accursed. Be to yourself a desolation and a blight, shunned by all that is good and virtuous, armed against all men, and all men armed against thee, Varney the Vampire." 2 years had passed since his death. He found himself in the reign of Charles II. Moreover, he found that he now craved blood. After telling his story, Varney leaves the priest. The final chapter of the book has Varney successfully killing himself and ending his curse by jumping into Mount Vesuvius. How a Vampire is Born. This is all over the place. Early on, Varney reassures Flora that his one attack on her wouldn't cause her to become a vampire. He would have to drink her blood periodically for years. But later he turns Clara Crofton into a vampire after one attack. Who knows what we're supposed to believe? Other than Clara, vampires seem to be cursed with their affliction due to some horrible sin committed in life. The fraternity of vampires that are supposed to wake their brothers up weren't there for when Varney raised from the dead, unless we're supposed to take it that disembodied voice he hears was a fellow vampire. Unlike the vampire that Varney helped awake, Varney was not resuscitated immediately after his death. He was in his grave for 2 years before he was raised. That could account for his horrible features. How to kill a vampire. As mentioned, Varney can be killed just as easily as an ordinary man. He gets killed countless times over the course of the book, only to come back by the cold rays of the moon. It takes jumping into Vesuvius to kill him, as far as we know. It's mentioned that vampires can't drown, as the waters will just push them away to the shore. This is flat out contradicted by his later attempt to drown himself. A stake is suggested as a weapon to use against him. When he gets revived, it would remain within him, killing him each time. Indeed, a stake works against Clara, the only vampire to be killed in the story. Beyond being an influence on Dracula, Varney hasn't had much direct influence on popular culture. He's been referenced in comics such as Marvel Comics' ancient Atlantean vampire Varney, but they're usually more Easter eggs than direct appearances, and usually suggests that the authors haven't actually read the original book, and I can't really blame them for that. Long after I read the book and did this drawing based on it, a TV series directly adapting the series was aired. I haven't seen it myself, so I can't attest to its quality, but there's absolutely no way it could be any worse than its source material. Well, that's it for Varney the Vampire. Hope you enjoyed this. I plan to make this a regular series, so make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more.